Welcome back to the Community of Innovation podcast brought to you by the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, otherwise known as CABHI. I'm Allison Sekuler, President and Chief Scientist at CABHI and the Baycrest Academy for Research and Education.
And I'm Rosanne Aleong, Executive Director of Research, Innovation, and Translation at the Baycrest Academy and the Director of Research, Innovation, and Translation at CABHI. Today, we're joined again by Maggie Perquin and Sylvia Davidson for our second podcast episode on sexuality, intimacy, and living with dementia. In our previous episode, Maggie and Sylvia explored the importance of intimacy in the aging journey, the challenges that 2S LGBTQI+ couples face, and how healthcare can better support people living with dementia and their partners. In today's episode, we will be doing a deeper dive into the often taboo nature of the topic, how we need to broaden our definition of intimacy beyond intercourse, and real-life examples of stigma and issues of sexuality and intimacy in healthcare environments. Okay, Allison, whenever we get Maggie and Sylvia in the same recording room, amazing things happen. And it was no different for take two. So what stood out for you?
I think what stood out for me was that intimacy really comes in so many different shapes and sizes, and it can change not just across different people, but for a person during different stages of their life and during different stages of a relationship throughout the course of a dementia journey and so on. But then the other thing that stood out for me was something that we keep hearing in episode after episode is how important it is to have these difficult conversations in advance so that you're talking about it and you're normalizing it. And that just makes it easier to deal with when these issues are coming up. What stood out for you?
So two things. I think the normalization, absolutely. And I think Maggie and Sylvia make the interesting point. It's, across the lifespan, you need to have these normalizing conversations, like talk to your children and your grandchildren, start early, and really familiarize them with these types of topics. So when maybe an urgent crisis happens, it's not coming out of the blue, and it can be a really meaningful conversation and decision that's made at any time at any point of the life. And then I think the second piece is just really around the idea of the importance of thinking about the caregiver in that changing dynamic, in terms of when couples, one individual is living with dementia, there's also the impact on that changing relationship on the caregiver and care partner. And Maggie so eloquently describes her experience and what that meant to her in her journey. So I think, again, we often talk about the importance and just the sheer vital nature of the caregiver in the whole environment. And again, that comes to the fore here.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think that was really important in this conversation is how layered on top of all of those issues are more specific issues that people who are part of the 2S LGBTQI+ community are facing. And that makes these conversations all the more important. So let's get to the show. Our first guest is Maggie Perquin. She's a wife, mother, grandmother, retired teacher, and was caregiver to her wife, Ruth, who recently passed away after living with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. Maggie and Ruth were partners for almost 29 years, and they were surrounded by loving children, grandchildren, and many, many close friends. Maggie has become a strong advocate for individuals living with dementia, working to improve their care within the community and healthcare system. We're so happy to have you back to the pod. Welcome back, Maggie.
Thank you. It is good to be back. And today is, in fact, our 17th wedding anniversary, or would have been. I still haven't gotten to the past tense on that yet. But it's full of the reminders of our growth and evolution through the intimacy labyrinth, as I like to call it. And so I'm really glad to be back and continue the conversation.
Well, thank you, Maggie, for joining us.
Yeah, and we're honored to have you back on this particular day.
So our second guest is a personal friend, Sylvia Davidson. As an occupational therapist, Sylvia works primarily with older adults. Although recently retired, for the past 12 years, she managed therapy services at Baycrest. She also teaches about relevant aging issues, particularly dementia care. And she is such a gem, and I always look for an opportunity to talk to her. So, Sylvia, welcome back to the pod. Thank you, Roseanne. So nice to be back. I am, as you've just heard, an occupational therapist. This particular topic is extremely important to me, and I think so valuable. I cannot tell you how amazing it is that CABHI is doing this and getting this conversation going, because I think that talking about this is so very important. And I am really consider myself fortunate to be on this podcast with Maggie and being able to sort of add some maybe background to the really important examples and content that Maggie has to share. So thanks, everybody. It's great to be back.
Well, we had a great, great conversation with both of you last time. And in that episode, you both explored the stigma and challenges that older adults living with dementia, especially those in the 2S LGBTQI plus community, experience when trying to seek intimacy and connection with their partners and to other people in general. And we wanted to follow up a little bit today and talk a little bit more about what you think is the stigma that might be related to that general taboo nature of sexuality and intimacy, and in particular, how ageism and other factors might play a role. So, Maggie, maybe we can start with you.
Thanks. Great way to start off. No matter who you are, whether you're young, whether you're middle aged, whether you're well into your seniors, nobody who knows you wants to think about you as being a sexual being. They certainly don't want to think about how you express it. And so then when you're a member of the queer community, always the big question is, well, how do you guys have sex? And so people can't get that kind of question out of their mind. And even if we were sitting on the couch holding hands, or if I gave Ruth a hug, particularly in front of the grandkids, they would all kind of laugh and go, Nana, go get a room. And so people just don't want to think of you that way. And yet our sexuality and our expression of our sexuality is just such an essential, integral part of who we are and part of a healthy, normal living. And so for us to express that is normal and natural. Kids don't want to own that, I guess. Whether your kids are 40 or 4, they don't want to own that. As you enter the golden years of life and aging sets in, things happen. Energy levels change, physical ability changes, cognition changes, and the ways in which you express your sexuality really change. And if you haven't had those conversations as a normal part of your relationship over the 40 or 50, or for us, almost 30 years, then it's really hard to bring it up when people are no longer in their normal state, should we say. And so, because there's, the three no talk list things are sex, money, and religion. Those are not the things that you talk around the dinner table at, because it'll ruin your dinner, right? And so, if you haven't had those conversations within your own relationship comfortably, then it becomes that much more difficult as you get to the place where you need to address those. And, in our relationship, there was also a significant age gap. That unto itself was an issue, which really wasn't an issue until the last 8 years. It really made no difference for us whatsoever. But it's a very personal topic. If you are within the baby boomer demographic, you have those tapes in your head that say it's dirty, it's shameful, it's secret, it's private, it's nobody's business. You have all of those tapes that are saying we don't talk about this. We just somehow mess around and kind of figure it out, and then there's all the backroom squalor kinds of messages that go with that. And yet it needs to be just this basic foundation of who you are. I love you. I love your body. I want to express my love for you sexually. And that is normative and isn't subversive. And how we get to that place is really, really quite a challenge, particularly with your best friends. I mean, I spoke last time about our very, very closest best friends group that we've had for 25 years. And even there, we don't talk about our expressions of sexuality. We joke about it. We we show cartoons about it. We make playful little aha comments about new toys that might have appeared or whatever, but we don't ever really talk about it. And that's sad, because I think that we can walk each other through this journey in with some degree of confidence if we know that other people are also having issues around expressing themselves differently, and that intercourse is no longer the best way or the only way, or comfortable way, or what doesn't take so much energy. Like, I don't want to give my partner a heart attack, so what, those kinds of things, right? How do we have those conversations? And it's tricky and it's hard.
And Sylvia, I mean, Maggie mentioned, sex and money and religion, but even if people don't want to talk about those things at the dinner table, it's not like there is a stigma associated with talking about your religion or a stigma associated with talking about money in the same way that there is a stigma about talking about your sexual encounters and your sexual desires. Especially as you get older, it's almost expected that you might be talking more about religion and money, but less about sex. So how does that interact with the ageism element?
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of aspect that I think we cannot ignore, because I do believe that there's a strong component of ageism. Maggie's talked about, family, kids who don't want to think about their parents having sex, but it's that, and it's so much more complicated as well, because you never know when someone, for example, starts to seek a new companion after the loss, and the losses associated with aging are really pervasive. There's so many things that an older person might be experiencing in terms of losses. And now you've got a child who is grieving, for example, the loss of a parent all over again, as they see the parent who's still alive looking for new companionship. It gets so complicated. And because we don't talk about it, it's really hard to open the door and start having those conversations. And I think, unfortunately, older adults themselves really start to accept this fate, that because they're old, they are no longer sexual beings. I heard it once described as a self-fulfilling prophecy for older persons, that they're going to just accept the fact that the losses and their age mean that it's no longer possible, whatever it is. And I know that we're going to get into this a little bit more, because just because you're old doesn't mean you suddenly lose the need for companionship or closeness. Things do start to change with aging. And I think part of the problem is because of the attitude that many people have and the stigma associated with aging generally. How do you get help if you suddenly are looking for, the solution to a problem because you have bad arthritis and you can't handle a vibrator anymore?
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are the sorts of things that I think we have to start getting a little more comfortable about, and that's why we have to talk about it.
Yeah, the Frankie and Grace invention is real. If people don't know what I'm talking about, they should watch Grace and Frankie, I think it's called. Yeah.
So, I mean, Sylvia, that leads perfectly into my next question. I think both you and Maggie have talked about the stigma, what we don't talk about. So, what are some ways that we can actually normalize conversations or acceptance about sexuality at all ages? So, grandkids, 4 or 44, and then thinking about this next generation of young people. Do you feel that there might be an generational difference in this next group coming forward, that there might be more openness to these conversations? Sylvia, I'm going to come back to you first, and then I'm going to go to Maggie, but I want to see how we tackle the non-conversations we're having.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting because indeed, sometimes in my teaching, because I do get asked to teach about this particular topic frequently, and I've had people go, well, probably the younger generation, they're more open, they're more free thinking, and I would say 90% of the time there's something that happens, and no, my experience has not been that just because people are from a free love generation or they're from the younger generation that they accept this. There is still a pervasive feeling that getting old is not cool, definitely not sexy. And so sexuality in later years is not a thing. And we haven't even talked about what do we mean by sexuality. And part of what I think in terms of getting these conversations going and normalizing, because it's not easy to have this conversation, but if we could stop thinking about it as like a dirty act and just start thinking about it more as part of who we are. And Maggie's already alluded to this, so I know she's going to expand on that. But we have to think about it as, Dad used to love golf and he's always been a hugger. Those two things are natural reflections of who the person was that we might want to continue to understand, because it'll help us know why they might now be interested in doing certain things. And the golf maybe is okay, but talking about hugging is not. And I'm not going anywhere near COVID with this, but I will reinforce that if COVID taught us nothing else, it taught us how devastating forced isolation can be, and how awful it is to force people to stop having any kind of human connection. And that's what I think we're missing. I often share in my teaching a quote from the World Health Organization, because a very long time ago they defined sexual health, and I'm going to share it. I'm sorry, I have to tell you. The World Health Organization defines sexual health as the integration of the somatic, emotional, intellectual, and social aspects of sexual being in ways that are positively enriching and that enhance personality, communication, and love. And that's what we need to talk about.
Well, with those words, I'm actually going to turn it over to Maggie to expand on it, because Maggie, I can see you nodding and wanting to get in on this conversation.
Well, because it is so much who we are. The love that you have for this person that you're in relationship with brings about chemical reactions in your body. Let's be that basil, it just does. And you want to celebrate that. You want to express that. And there's a delight. There's like all the hormones that are raging, in a body, regardless of what age they're at. Change how you express your desire, your need to be near this person, to be with this person, to touch this person, to kiss them, to hold their hand, to caress them, to do all of those things. And sadly, the main message now is predator. You can't put yourself out there because there's predators. You can't look like that because there's predators. You can't offer yourself in a certain way because there's predators. And that's the message that my grandchildren, unfortunately, are growing up under, which again, I think then subverses everything back to secretive and hush hush and all of those things, except we also have the Me Too movement, and we have, yes, my voice, I can say no to you. You cannot do this to me without consent. So there's so many conflicting things in that generation right now. I am allowed, we don't, body shaming is a big thing. We don't body shame as much as we used to, sort of, maybe. That leave social media out of that. And, there's all of those kinds of things. And yet when you get older, so think of what you go through as a teenager, how you need to learn to live with this body that is erupting and developing in front of you, sometimes in embarrassing ways. The same thing happens when you're 80 years old. This exact same thing, except that everything goes south. It's fallen in places it shouldn't have to fall. And it doesn't work the way it does, except you still have this relationship that you're part of. And so you don't know what to do with those changes when things don't work, when erectile dysfunction becomes an issue, and you don't know what to do with that. And if you have not had any of those conversations over the course of your marriage, or if the guys have talked to the guys and the girls have talked to the girls, but they've not talked to each other, then, what do you do with that when you get to that age where what used to never stop working never starts working anymore? And that changes. So how do you deal with that? Because, that's the biggest part of aging. Our bodies just function differently, not in ways in which we wish they would, and it can become quite embarrassing. It can become shameful again, but in a different way. So if we don't have that foundation that says, you know what, it's okay. I am just okay to lie here and put my head on your chest and my arm across your belly, and we're okay. This is just fine. This is enough. And if I need more, I will take care of that on my own because I'm comfortable with that. Right. So, but if you don't have those conversations, like if that concept of self-pleasure is threatening in your relationship, if it was in the earlier years of your relationship, how are you going to deal with that in the later years? And I don't know how, other than just having those really difficult conversations and naming them that. And I used to say, like, we need to have a really delicate conversation. And I don't necessarily want a response right now. I just want you to think about what I'm going to say.
So, Maggie, you mentioned this conversation between you and a partner, for example. But Sylvia, in the context of, that changing health and that changing sexual health, adult children or POAs might start to come into that picture further into the journey. And I'm wondering, how do you normalize that conversation with your adult children who may play a role in your health later on how do you normalize that conversation to say, yeah, I'm getting older. This is what it's going to look like. I still want to express myself sexually. How do we support that?
That's a really good question. I mean, I spend a lot of time when we haven't introduced the issue of dementia yet. I have a big concern about the fact that as people, never mind the stigma with aging, the fear of getting a diagnosis of dementia and what that means, and therefore the lack of discussion with family and people close to you around what things might look like as that disease progresses. Not even going there. The idea that it's this issue of language, if we don't want to call it sex, then can we talk about, I don't know, relationships? And what does a relationship mean to any one of us? The thing is, it's different for everyone. And so if I'm going to have that conversation with my kids, because I'm in the business of teaching about this and I know what's going to happen down the road, and I am going to end up being, abandoned, and some poor child of mine is going to get the call from the staff in the nursing home telling them what horrible thing has happened. I don't want my kids to have the kind of freak out that many people do, which means I have to start talking to them now about what's important to me. And in a way, I think part of the struggle might be that when you put it like that, it sounds very selfish. But I think that that's where I think maybe some of us have to start, is we need to talk about this because this is going to be important to me. This is who I am. You might not like it, but things might change and you might get the call. So I want us to start talking now about how we continue to be a family, how you continue to support me, even as I change. And maybe it's hard because it does seem selfish, but I think at some point we have to stop and think, what is important to me? What kind of a person am I? Do my friends and family and the people who are going to end up hopefully carrying on with me on this journey, do they see me as a bit of a flirt? Do they see their dad as a bit of a ladies' man? Those kinds of terms have got a certain kind of connotation, but that's the kind of language that sometimes I find we have to start exploring to help understand who the person is, because it's going to help us understand what they might be looking for down the road. If I'm a bit of a flirt, I'm going to keep being a bit of a flirt when I get older.
Or even more of a flirt, yeah.
Maybe, yeah, I might be more of a flirt. It's so difficult to unpack it because I think it's so individualized. But I do think sometimes part of the hesitation in even starting that conversation, because it does feel like, first it's icky, and sometimes it does maybe feel a bit selfish. But if this is going to be important to me as my journey continues, I have to start finding a way to open up the conversation with them.
Well, I'm only half joking when I say you might be more of a flirt, because we often say that as you get older, you become more of whatever you were. Your inhibitions sort of decline. And so if you were a flirt, you very well may become more of a flirt. And so, is that part of what the discussion is with the kids, with the family members and others? And going back to that, World Health Organization definition that you gave us, Sylvia, when you talked about what it means to have sexual health, it didn't mention intercourse, right? It mentioned other kinds of connection and what makes you feel like good for yourself. So there's this broad spectrum of human connection. And it can be challenging to define, but, is that a place that we can be starting and telling the kids, it is the case that as we get older, we become more. And some of the kind of connections that I have enjoyed over my life, you might see those emerging as I become more. And here are the different kinds of connections. I wonder if you can talk about, like, what are those different kind of connections? And is this one way into that conversation?
I have a perfect story for that. So my father died when my mom was 7 months pregnant with me, and she never remarried. So my mother was a widow for all of my existence. When I was probably 55 or something like that, my mom moved into an assisted living facility. And the next thing we know, we would, call her in the evenings and whatnot. And there's a knock at her door. And I said, Mom, it's 11 o'clock. Who's knocking at your door? Oh, that's just Stan. Oh, who's Stan, Mom? Oh, he's just the man across the hall. He just comes to tuck me into bed at night. And I had to go WTF in my head. Like, Okay, wait a minute, because my mom never remarried after my dad died. She was a well sought after woman by many men, but never entered another relationship. She was too heartbroken by my dad's death, yada, yada, yada. And so now, 55 years later, this man is coming to tuck her into bed. And she says, just a minute, I'll go open the door. And then she said, she'll come back to the phone and she said, okay, I better go. He's here in his bear pelt. Right? There was part of me that wanted to go, you go, girl, like you go, because you have been alone for 55 years. You're 80, whatever she was at the point, 88, something like that. It didn't matter that, someone was courting her, for lack of a better word, flirting with her, whatever. And, and he had been married and whatever, they had friends in common, but who knows? Like, who knows how this expression is going to happen? And I remember being shocked, and yet here I am thinking I'm very forward thinker and blah, 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 But for children whose other parent is not yet deceased, when those kinds of things begin to happen, there is an enormous amount of betrayal that goes with that, because daddy's not dead yet.
Yeah.
He's in long-term care. Yes, he has dementia. No, he doesn't know who you are anymore, but he's not dead. And already this other man is coming after you. So there's a mitload of feelings and emotions and reactions that go along with that. And again, like Sylvia says, if we've not entered that conversation, or the other thing that happens is, the daughter appears in the father's room and the father thinks it's the wife when they were courting at a young age, right? And begins to embrace her and connect with her in ways that he would have with his wife 60, 70 years ago. So if we don't have those conversations ahead of time, and give the kids strategies, graceful strategies and ways to exit that scenario so that everybody's dignity is kept intact, then we're not doing anybody any service. It's heartbreaking when that happens, when you realize that, this woman is now letting this nude man enter her room, and yet the father's still alive.
No, there is a bear pelt. So.
Yeah, exactly. So like just those, like, there's nothing off the table. There just isn't, because we don't know where this cognitive decline journey is going to take us. And, it is not uncommon in long-term care to walk into your partner's room and have, another person on the bed with them. And how do you react as the wife? How do you react to that? Or as the other partner, how do you react to that? And I never got there, thankfully, so I've never had to deal with that, but I do have friends who have. And I mean, it is heartbreaking. It is gut-wrenching. It is devastating. It is all of those things, until you can get yourself back to the rational mind that says, well, they no longer know who I am anyway. So I can't take this as a betrayal. But if we don't ever, ever, ever have those conversations as part of this journey, and we don't want to, because we, even as adult children, don't want to admit that our parents are going to get there.
And Sylvia, I'm wondering your thoughts on this. I mean, in terms of Maggie's talking about specific kinds of connections and interactions, and the interaction obviously with dementia. And what are your thoughts about how, the different kinds of the spectrum of human connections, and how those might change through the dementia journey?
It's part of where I think we're not having those conversations early enough. The idea that and the thing is, everyone's different. So it's hard to just get a recipe. Okay, I've got a diagnosis, I have dementia, this is what's going to happen. We don't know for sure. And I think that's where maybe as healthcare providers, I will put my hand up and say, we let our clients and our patients and the people with dementia and their care partners down, because we're not giving, good information right from the start. We're not encouraging those conversations. There is indeed the possibility that someone who is profoundly cognitively impaired will become hypersexual, and they will insist on, incessant sexual intercourse. I mean, I've talked about the scope of what we mean by intimacy, everywhere from just a touch on the shoulder from someone to full-blown intercourse, and everything in between. And you could indeed, I remember working with a woman who cared for her husband at home, for several years as he deteriorated before she couldn't cope any longer, and he moved into a nursing home, and within a year he had died. And during one of my teaching sessions, she shared with me that he had become very aggressive sexually and demanded sex of her constantly when she was still caring for him at home. And she went along with it because she was his wife. Although it was destroying her because she really didn't feel he had any idea who she was anymore. He was just seeking sex. She never told anybody. And she had affiliations with the Alzheimer's Society, but nobody had ever thought to create an environment. And I'm not saying that what we have to do is say, is your partner taking sexual advantage of you? But somehow we need to be able to explore the relationship, because relationships change. And dementia is a primary risk factor for a relationship changing. And if we don't even pose the question, this poor woman never felt she could tell anybody what she was struggling with. And that breaks my heart because, when she told me, we had a long talk. I asked if I could share her story as an example, and she said absolutely, if it would do anything to change things for people. And I do share this often because that kind of situation happens far more often than we are willing to accept. Because first off, people don't want to get a diagnosis of dementia. And when they do, if you get a cancer diagnosis, you usually start talking to your family about what plans are going to be made. What do you want to do? But you get a dementia diagnosis and nobody wants to talk about it. There is great stigma associated with this issue of dementia. We have to talk about it because it is probably highly likely that as you progress with the illness, you are going to stop being able to express your own wishes and say in an informed way what you want to do through your words. And somebody else around you is going to be making decisions on your behalf. And if we've never talked about what kind of relationships I might want down the road, if we've never had the opportunity, Maggie, your example is perfect because your mom had been a widow. Who even knew that she might be interested in exploring, a relationship down the road, right? Circumstances change, and she ended up in a situation where someone appeared in her life. And like you said, part of you is going, you go, girl, because not everyone has the chance to have another chance at that kind of a relationship, but it's so important. We have to talk about it. The same thing happened when my dad died. My mom basically swore off any relationship. And then the gentleman down the road started paying attention to her. And funnily enough, my sister and I thought it was a great idea. My mother was disgusted by the fact because she felt it was going to be a betrayal of her relationship with my father. And so that was fine. We dealt with that, but everybody's different. And if we don't at least talk about it, and it took the prompt of my sister and I trying to encourage my mom to indeed have coffee with this gentleman for him to say no, she would under no circumstances want anything to do with him. And that was how she intended to live the rest of her life. At least it was a tiny bit of the discussion. We didn't really talk much more about anything else, but I kept that in my mind because I knew that there was a chance down the road that she was going to end up in a situation where things might change. And at least I had an idea about what her wishes might have been. And we don't talk about it. And the other thing that we haven't really got to yet, I hope we have a bit of time to get to it, is these kinds of conversations are also the kinds of conversations that family, for example, or the spouses, partners are going to have with the staff who are going to be working to look after this individual when they move into a retirement home or into a long-term care home, because those are the people who are going to start encountering the situations, and they need to know what's important to this person, what's going to be meaningful to this person, so that they don't shut the door on human connection just because they're afraid it's going to end up with two people having sex in bed.
I want to build on what you just said, Sylvia, and talk about that relationship change, because Maggie, you've talked to us before about the diagnosis with Bruce and how that led to a dynamic and relationship change. And then obviously the intimacy needs of both Ruth, but also yourself. Can you talk to us a little bit about that change and what that meant for the two of you?
There's definitely a shift in the relationship. And it actually happened even before Ruth was officially diagnosed, where I began to see that the amount of energy that she was spending on her relationship with her siblings far outweighed the energy she was spending in a relationship with me. To a degree, there had always been a separation in Ruth's family, because her family, in terms of her children and grandchildren, never really intersected with my children and grandchildren. There was just always a separation there. That was her desire, for many, many, many reasons. And so it wasn't unusual to watch a bit more of a separation. But the more I saw this energy shift happen, the more it alerted me to the fact that something was changing, that something else was happening. And then when it got to the place where little rituals, our little romantic thing, we always exchanged stockings on Christmas Eve. We always were very intentional about the kinds of things that went in our stockings. There was always some personal items in there and whatever. And one year I didn't do that, and there were no comments made. There was no acknowledgement of those things missing. I used to give her little clocks with dates on them. And those dates would be special occasions for us, where things we were going to do together or whatever. And I didn't do that one year, and there was no comment made. And that's sort of what began to alert me that something was happening, long before we ever got to any kind of diagnosis. That was about 4 years at least before a diagnosis. And so the personality, when dementia and understand, again, Sylvia's already alerted us to this, dementia inhabits each person uniquely. And with many of the dementias, and understand that Alzheimer's is one of the dementias, memory is not a significant characteristic of the early stage of most dementias other than Alzheimer's. And so personality change is, particularly with frontotemporal, for example. As Ruth progressed through her stages, my relationship to her changed. I was no longer her wife. I was no longer her most precious, the one that, she sought to give me surprises or do special things for me. I lost that. I simply became the caregiver, the chauffeur, the cook, the cleaner, the banker, the travel agent, all of those kinds of things, right? And so as that happens in a relationship, it's almost like, in some ways, it's almost like there's an affair happening, because the priority of the person changes, right? Her priority were her siblings and her family of origin, not me. And I mean, obviously, there's nothing happening with the siblings, but that's the primary energy. That's where her primary emotions were being directed. And so that's very isolating for me. And therefore, then the sexual expression begins to change. And she would say things to me, well, I know you're tired. You're working so hard to take care of me. And that was her excuse as to why she wasn't getting frisky, as we used to talk. That was kind of our word, right? And, when I would say things like, would you like to cuddle tonight? Oh, well, I'm just so tired. I'm just going to go right to sleep. And those kinds of things. And so when you have this emotional separation, and then you get intentional answers to, foreplay questions, put whatever word you want on that are negative. And there's a walking away from situations. And even, as I said in episode 1, we always had this routine, because I have a really bad neck and spine. I used to sit on the floor in front of her at the couch, and she would massage my neck, and, and then often we'd have a kiss and a hug and whatever else. That stopped. Like, it just stopped. It never got beyond that functional stage of helping the pain in my neck and shoulders. So you get lonely. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, at 6 a.m, she'd appear in my room, because after she fell down the stairs and broke her back, we slept separately, because I was always afraid of hurting her, because I'm a very restless sleeper. And so she would appear in my room at 6 a.m. and crawl into bed, and all of a sudden be frisky. And I'm like, what the hell is this? A, I don't do mornings at 6 o'clock. B, right? B, I haven't had, so it catches you off guard. And as a caregiver, when you're constantly giving, your bucket drains out pretty darn quickly. And so and yet I don't want to miss the opportunity, So it just adds like layers and layers and layers of complication to the whole situation. I don't ever want to feel inauthentic in that position. I don't. If we are being intimate with one another, I want to make sure that I'm fully present. And you just get to the place where you're not. And so then it almost becomes an act of avoidance of even allowing those situations to happen. And yet for years, like sometimes I'm going, oh my God, this, how long can I do this sort of thing? Right.
And Maggie, you're talking about a case where you're living together. And so she's appearing in your room at 6 a.m., getting frisky. But Sylvia, you mentioned before, some of the other cases where people may be living with advanced dementia. They may actually not be living at home with their partner, spouse, caregivers. They may be living in long-term care. They may be showing up in someone else's room at 6 a.m. and wanting to get frisky, right? And so what are sort of the common responses that you see in those situations, especially with older adults, those with late-stage dementia, whose relationship with their partner or their spouse might have changed a little bit, and or their living environment has obviously changed, and so they might be trying to seek intimacy with other residents, and how should the long-term care staff, as well as the partners who are supporting from a distance, how should they be responding, and where do consent and personhood come into play in all of this?
That's a really complicated question, Allison, but it's a good one. I mean, I can tell you right off the bat, how do staff in an institutional setting respond? It's all over the map.
To the 6 a.m. visits.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even remember if I shared in the first example, one of the nursing homes that I was supporting over time a few years ago. The night shift shared with me the story of two people who had found each other and were crawling into bed together, both cognitively impaired. And the nurse who normally worked nights on that shift had initially tried to separate them. And what they did was created far more agitation and aggression from these two people. And so the nurse and the person who was normally working night shift with her decided that they were going to support the two of them sleeping together. They had never really observed anything happen other than the two people just finding each other and crawling into bed together. They would let them sleep through the night. They made sure well before their shift change ended and the day shift was coming on that they woke these two individuals up and separated them. And they didn't tell anybody because they didn't think it would be allowed. Nobody talked about it. This is just something they worked out together. And then what always happens is the charge nurse who had originally developed the plan was off, and her partner in crime ended up missing the same shift. And other staff found what was happening. Literally, pardon my French, all hell broke loose. And one of those nurses actually lost their job. And I share that story because the staff who told me about it were completely mixed in their response, because some of them fully supported what these two staff had decided to do. And so it was an opportunity to talk about, like, what else could they have done if indeed this was the plan they were going to go forward with. Because the idea of not allowing this particular expression of a need to happen, if we think about dementia and how we try and understand dementia, behaviors in people with dementia often, and when I say behaviors, I'm speaking usually about what we talk about as responsive behaviors, what many people still want to hang on to as difficult or challenging behaviors. These behaviors are coming out of a need. And so if I'm yelling constantly, it's probably because I need something. And it's our job to try and do the detective work and figure out what that need is. Well, the behavior that these two individuals were demonstrating was coming out of a need for companionship. I mean, you've been sleeping with the same person for 50 years in the bed with that warm, and I don't care if they fart and burp and snore and kick, you've been beside them for 50 years and all of a sudden you're ripped apart. You're looking for maybe just a warm body. Maybe you're looking for someone to be frisky with. That's the thing. We don't really know what it is that they might be seeking, but there is a need there. If you just try and put a stop to that need, the problem with dementia is you're probably going to create another fallback behavior. And indeed, often it is restlessness, agitation, aggression. And so they had done, I thought they'd done good work in coming to a decision, but there were so many things that they hadn't done. And the first one was not talking about it. And as I said, there were people who supported what they did, and there were still staff who thought it was disgusting what they'd been allowed to do. Staff are afraid to even see people holding hands because they assume it's that slippery slope that's going to lead to intercourse.
I got to ask, I mean, they're holding hands. Those are presumably heterosexual relationships that they're looking at there. And I'm just wondering if you layer on top of that, the need for connection amongst people in the 2S LGBTQI plus community. How is that being interpreted? And how do we make sure that people, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of whoever they are, who they love, that everyone is getting their needs met the way that they need to have those needs met? So maybe, Sylvia, we can start with you and then turn to Maggie.
And I'll just jump in quickly and say it has to start with those conversations. And if it's an institutional setting, the institution has to be making an effort to try and recognize that the needs and the wants and the quality of life of every person there has to be important and respected and supported whenever possible. Staff are afraid of risk, but they're also afraid of being blamed. And if we would start talking about this from the minute someone is coming in the door, I think it would go a long way to trying and address some of these barriers, but we won't talk about it. Maggie, you've probably got far more concrete examples to share.
What comes into my head first is that staff need to deal with their own biases around same-sex couples and same-sex expression. They absolutely have to, because as I said in session 1, there are policies in virtually every institution. Some of the private ones don't have, but virtually every public institution has a policy that says this is safe space. But it isn't when a gay man is trying to engage with a straight man. There is horror around that, because if he's doing it with this one, he's going to do it with all the other gentlemen. And then we have to put the police in place and make sure that he's not engaging in that. And as Sylvia has said, that just raises agitation, that just raises anxiety all around it. For some reason, that two women holding hands or hugging or whatever is not quite as oppositional to staff as to men, particularly if one is straight and one is not. But the staff, there needs to be so much training about, A, dementia-friendly communities and what that looks like, and B, your own bias, and checking that, check and putting all of those tapes. And, dare I be bold enough to say, if it's not something you can handle, then ask for a transfer, do something, because human connection is so, so essential to who we are. And as I told you, the last thing Ruth did before she died was reach out to hold my hand. And I wasn't even on the side of the bed that her hand was working, but that's what she did. And that's just who we are, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And especially when you're at the stage of dementia where you don't know who the person is anyway, but you are just seeking that comfort, that security that you've had for how many years, So we need to do a lot of work on anti-bias training for staff, first and foremost. And second of all, we just need to stop being shocked by it. We just absolutely need to stop being shocked. We are all humans. We seek connection. That is our journey on earth, is to find our soulmate. And whatever level of cognition you have left, there is still that quest in you for that comfort, for that security. And you're going to do whatever it takes to find it. My friend will say she'll go into her husband's room and sometimes there's 3 or 4 people on his bed because he's the friendly guy. And that's who people gravitate to, and how she had to, stop being shocked by that and yet say, yes, that is the essence of her husband, who she has loved since she was 16 years old, and right now in their 70s. But it's just normal. It's natural. And we need to stop. And then I don't know how you deal with the other families, because sometimes the other families go absolutely off the wall and they'll, threaten this and threaten that and want this and want that. And, as an ED, it's not necessarily joyous to deal with those kinds of situations. But as Sylvia said, typically there's a lot of behind the door quiet things that are going on that staff are allowing because they know it's normal and natural, hoping that they don't get reprimanded and lose their job in that situation.
We just needed signs everywhere in the long-term care that says, we are who we are, and love is love, and we all need connection. That would make life a much, much better place.
Yeah, exactly. And why, if we're trying to protect people's dignity and give them a quality of life, why are we so opposed to my partner reaching out to someone else when I'm not there? Why am I so opposed to that? Why is that? She doesn't know who I am anyway. So why am I so threatened by that, right? And again, we have to do our own work around all of that. But the love that you have for that person, I will admit, I'm grateful we didn't get there, because it wouldn't have been easy. But I know, already in my head, I was prepared that may happen. But Like, why is it not okay that they're allowed those moments of pleasure, that they're allowed those moments of comfort?
So, building on that, I think as we close the episode, I want to maybe try to see if we can grab some strategies and advice for our listening audience, because I'd love for them to take all that you have said to heart and maybe enact something in their life. So, Maggie, maybe I can start with you in terms of, is there a piece of advice that you would give to our audience for them to promote intimacy or connection in their relationships as they go through their aging journey? I think we've established that it doesn't always have to be sexual. It can be a human connection. What would you say to our audience to maybe help them along the way?
Just, continue those conversations, continue those normal patterns, and you'll need to judge. Like, there were times where I could sit physically right beside Ruth on the couch, hold her hand, kind of lean into her, whatever. There were other times where she absolutely wouldn't allow me to do that. It was just not comfortable, depending on whatever, and I never knew what the whatever was, right? But I would say that continue those normal patterns until they become too threatening or too uncomfortable for people who don't recognize themselves in the mirror anymore. When they're at that point, right? They may become too agitated and too volatile with those situations. But, continue, like, just because you're old doesn't mean you can't pat your partner on the butt. Cute bum, and make those comments, right? Woohoo, hot chick today, those kinds of things. Like, don't let that go, because it puts a dance in your step, if nothing else. And we all need that. We all need that, because it's a hell of a hard job being a caregiver to this person who you are so intimately, passionately in love with, who is no longer your person, right? It's freaking difficult. It's hard, it's mean, it steals your person. So you need to do whatever you need to do to keep that spark there. And if you get a response, yahoo. And if you don't, that was one of those lost moments that you can add to the many others you've had, right?
And Sylvia, what advice would you give to people with partners in long-term care homes or, nursing homes, retirement homes, whatever you want to call them, who are looking for more intimacy and connection with their partners, but are met with barriers due to the rules or, consent issues with the staff? What would you tell those partners?
If you're fortunate enough to be able to start these conversations, it's all about conversations. If you're fortunate enough to start the conversations from the minute the person is being considered for admission, start them and be prepared for shock on the part of the staff who are conducting their admission assessments. We ask multiple questions when admitting people into our institutions. Very rarely is there a question about even a sleeping arrangement or what kind of, person is your husband in terms of, like touchy-feely, do they like to hug? Those little questions. If you are the person who knows this individual best, start that conversation. If the person is already well settled in the home, start the conversations anyway. It's never too late to start having a conversation. And maybe it's based on something you observed. And so, you kind of just want to let people know that maybe it's okay, because too often I think staff in our institutions really are worried that someone's going to sue. As Maggie has said, I, as a family member, may be totally okay with what's happening, but another family member will not be. And the staff are so afraid of risk and liability and being blamed for doing something wrong. And then we've got all the ageism and the stigma and everything that we're afraid to talk about. So these conversations aren't going to happen until something happens that someone decides needs to be reported, and then you get the call. I would encourage you to just have a conversation. And maybe it's a simple question like, has he shown any interest in anyone now that he's been here for a while? If you're not able to start having the conversation about whether your partner or your parent might be looking to have a conversation. My father-in-law was very clear about the fact that 1 year after his wife's death, he was going to be looking for another partner. Ended up in a retirement home, and you bet he did start seeking female companionship. Interestingly enough, I'm the only member of the family he told. When we got the call, the rest of the family was going, oh my God.
And you're like, good for him.
Good for him.
Well, I just want to say that is that also the conversation that you dare to practice having with your adult children?
Yes.
Right? So, mom's gone in or dad's gone in, and, we need to talk about that. And you can practice the conversation with your children, which is going to be honestly way harder than it will be with a staff member, but at least it cracks the ice. So when the staff member, maybe you're away and the staff member have to call the child as the next of kin and say, dad's messing around a whole lot, you're not going to fall off your chair because you've at least had that preparatory conversation. I don't know too many parents who would be willing to have that, but dare I offer that as a suggestion?
Well, you could say to the kids, I'm going to have this conversation with the staff people. So I'd like to practice it with you. And that might be a good entree if you're uncomfortable having it with the kids to start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, like every episode, we always ask our guests for their recommendations about resources that our audience should check out. So, I'm going to start off with Maggie. What are the resources that you would advise they check out?
Once again, I say go to the Alzheimer's Society of Ontario or your local chapter. There are many, many, many webinars there around dementia and brain health and dynamics. And not the Alzheimer's Society's mandate is not to deal with long-term care. So you might not find that there, but you will find all kinds of information around changes in personality, symptoms to watch for, reluctance for diagnosis, all of those kinds of things are there. They're not brave enough yet to post anything about sexuality, but that's okay. We take care of it here. So go to CABHI as well, because CABHI has all kinds of resources. The other one is just Dementia Friendly Canada. Anything to do with Dementia Friendly Canada is just about engaging within your community and ensuring that all the services and facilities, et cetera, within your community are dementia friendly.
Thank you, Maggie. Over to you, Sylvia.
I also strongly encourage people to reach out to their local chapter of the Alzheimer's Society. And I will say that I've been asked several times in the last few months to offer webinars for Alzheimer's Society staff around this specific topic. So I think that there is some progress being made. Staff are expressing a wish to learn more about intimacy when talking about persons with dementia. So I think it's a huge step forward.
You're part of a revolution. Here we go.
Here you go. I also can't not shout out to Pink Cherry and Come As You Are, two groups that are kind of under the radar a lot of the times, but in terms of sex toys, a comfortable environment where you can explore how to enhance your own sexuality, maybe find a way to explore your sexuality if you no longer have a partner. Those kinds of links, I think, are very important. Pink Cherry is something that I do share with the occupational therapy students at the University of Toronto, because I'm hoping that they will start to overcome some of the taboos and stigmas and start talking to people about changes in physical things that mean it's harder to do the sorts of things you used to do, including sexual gratification.
But again, normalizing the conversation. If
Yes.
you put it into the next generations of healthcare providers' brains that this is part of their practice, then maybe they will also be open to having those conversations with partners and adult children and ready to meet them where they're at.
Exactly. If we ask about toileting,
Why can't we ask about sexuality?
yeah, sexuality.
All right. Allison has told me she's got a resource. Can't let it go. Go, Allison.
So my first resource is episode 1 of this conversation. So definitely go back if you haven't heard that. Go back and listen to that. But the other one, just because we have talked quite a lot around the 2S LGBTQI plus issues, is your local support groups. So, for example, PFLAG. There are PFLAG, PFLAG that started as the Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, and it's much, much broader now. And there are chapters everywhere. And because of pandemic, a lot of them are actually operating virtually, right? So like the Toronto chapter has a lot of its meetings virtual as support groups, and people can join from anywhere in Canada, anywhere in the world. So even if there isn't a local chapter, you can get this sort of support. And these are, whether it's PFLAG, whether it's EGAL, whether it's one of these other sorts of support groups, you can have these conversations with people who have lived experience and have shared experience. And that's, you won't feel as alone. I think that's really the critical thing is sometimes when you're going through these sorts of issues, you think you're the only one. And, depending on the nature of your relationships and, you may be in a dementia, caregiver support group, the only one from the queer community, but there are other people out there. And so it's important to make sure that you're expanding your horizons and getting the right sort of support, and seeing that there are other people who've gone through this and who you can share your experiences with and get advice from. So I would just encourage folks to be looking out for those kinds of resources as well. And Rosanne, I think you also have a resource that you want to share, correct?
Well, if you're going to call out Love Out Loud, which was our first episode with Maggie and Sylvia, I'm also going to call out an episode from a previous season, Little Acts of Love, which also was one of our innovators who were really operating to try to support 2S LGBTQI plus individuals in long-term care. So check that episode out too.
Thank you both so much for joining us for part 2 of our conversation today.
Thank you.
This is great. I'm really glad that we've decided to just tackle this head on. I couldn't pick a better partner in Sylvia. She's awesome.
You go, girl.
We also want to thank our podcast production team, including Monique Chang, Lisa Hartford, and our friends over at Podtex.
To learn more about CABHI, please visit us at cabhi.com. That's CABHI.com. And if you want to support CABHI, you can donate at baycrest.org/donate to CABHI. That's BAYCREST.org/DONATETOCABHI. We'll be sure to add the address in our episode show notes. We'd also love your support of our podcast, so please hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your pods.